Episode number 13.
Emma Rodriguez pressed her face against the small, oval window of Flight 447, watching the ground shrink away beneath the Boeing 737 as it climbed through the morning clouds. At 12 years old, she was traveling alone for the first time. But unlike other kids her age who might be nervous or excited about the adventure, Emma felt a familiar calm wash over her as the aircraft reached its cruising altitude. This wasn't her first time in a cockpit, not by a long shot. She clutched her worn copy of Advanced Flight Operations Manual against her chest, the same book her father had used during his 20-year career as a commercial pilot. The pages were dog-eared and filled with her handwritten notes in the margins, observations and questions she'd accumulated during countless hours spent in his home flight simulator. Captain Miguel Rodriguez had died in a small plane crash 13 months ago, but his lessons lived on in every page Emma had memorized. Flying isn't about the plane, he used to tell her during their weekend training sessions. It's about reading the sky, understanding the machine, and staying 3 steps ahead of trouble. Emma had logged over 500 hours on his professional grade simulator, more than some student pilots accumulated before their first solo flight. Her mother thought it was an unhealthy obsession, a way of clinging to her father's memory, but Emma knew better. Aviation was in her blood. The other passengers saw what they expected to see, a quiet, well-behaved child traveling alone, probably visiting divorced parents or grandparents. The businessman in 12A had smiled condescendingly when she'd politely declined his offer to switch seats so she could sit away from the wing. He didn't understand that Emma specifically requested seat 12F because it offered the perfect view of the engine nacelles and wing control surfaces. She wanted to monitor the flight systems just as her father had taught her. Always be aware of your aircraft's condition, his voice echoed in her memory. Listen to the engines, watch the control surfaces, feel the vibrations through the airframe. The plane will tell you everything you need to know if you know how to listen. And right now, Flight 447 was telling her something was wrong. Emma's trained ear detected a subtle irregularity in the left engine's rhythm. Not quite a miss, but a barely perceptible variation in the turbine's whine that most passengers would never notice. She pulled out her notebook and jotted down the time. 10:47 a.m., approximately 15 minutes after takeoff. The vibration through the fuselage felt slightly off too, a minor tremor that suggested possible engine mount stress or fuel flow inconsistency. But what concerned her more than the mechanical symptoms were the human ones she'd observed during boarding. Captain Torres, a silver-haired man in his late 50s, had looked exhausted as he'd performed his pre-flight walk-around. Emma had watched him through the terminal window, noting how he'd rubbed his eyes repeatedly and checked his watch with the weary expression of someone running on too little sleep. During boarding, she'd overheard him mention to the gate agent that this was his 4th flight in 2 days, a brutal schedule that pushed the limits of FAA regulations. First Officer Walsh appeared even worse. The younger pilot, probably in his early 30s, had been massaging his temples during the safety briefing, and Emma noticed his hands trembling slightly when he'd adjusted his headset. She'd seen that look before in her father's pilot friends, the telltale signs of fatigue, stress, and possibly the early stages of hypoxia or other medical issues that could compromise judgment and reaction time. Crew resource management, her father had always emphasized, means everyone on that flight deck needs to be operating at peak performance. One weak link can kill everyone on board. Emma shifted in her seat and glanced toward the cockpit. The symptoms were identical. Confusion, loss of coordination, euphoria, followed by unconsciousness, and ultimately death if exposure continued. In the cockpit, First Officer Walsh was struggling to understand why his vision was becoming blurry. The instrument panel seemed to be moving, the numbers and displays swimming in and out of focus. He tried to call air traffic control to report a problem, but couldn't remember the radio frequency. His training, accumulated over thousands of flight hours, was being systematically erased by the invisible poison flooding his bloodstream. "Something's wrong," Walsh managed to say, but his words were barely coherent. He reached for the oxygen mask stored beside his seat, the emergency backup that could save his life, but his movements were clumsy and uncoordinated. His fingers fumbled with the mask's straps as precious seconds ticked away. Captain Torres had stopped responding entirely. His head lolled forward, chin resting on his chest, hands falling away from the controls. The autopilot continued to maintain their altitude and heading, but the aircraft's fate now hung on a computer system that couldn't think, couldn't adapt, and couldn't save them if anything went wrong. Emma unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, ignoring the confused looks from nearby passengers. She had to get to the cockpit, had to help somehow. But the aisle seemed impossibly long. Other passengers were beginning to notice that something was amiss. The cockpit door was wide open now, and they could see one pilot slumped unconscious over the controls. "Sit down, honey," called the businessman from 12A. "The crew knows what they're doing." But Emma could see that the crew was dying. First Officer Walsh made one final, desperate attempt to don his oxygen mask. His training screamed at him through the carbon monoxide haze. Oxygen mask first, then troubleshoot the problem. But his motor skills had deteriorated too far. The mask slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered to the cockpit floor as he slumped sideways in his seat unconscious. The autopilot, programmed to maintain level flight, continued its electronic vigilance. But autopilot systems weren't designed to handle every emergency. They couldn't detect carbon monoxide leaks, couldn't recognize pilot incapacitation, and couldn't make the complex decisions required to save an aircraft in crisis. Emma reached the front of the cabin just as Flight Attendant Maria emerged from the galley with a concerned expression. "Excuse me, sweetie, you need to return to your seat," Maria said, but her voice trailed off as she looked past Emma into the cockpit. Both pilots were unconscious. "Oh my God," Maria breathed, rushing past Emma into the flight deck. She'd been trained in basic first aid, but nothing in her emergency procedures manual had prepared her for this scenario. She checked Captain Torres for a pulse weak but present, then tried to shake him awake. "Captain? Captain Torres!" No response. Emma pushed into the cockpit behind Maria, her mind racing through everything her father had taught her about emergency procedures. The first priority was always the same: aviate, navigate, communicate. Keep the aircraft flying, figure out where you're going, then tell someone about your problem. "We need to get them on oxygen," Emma said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. She'd read about carbon monoxide poisoning in her father's medical aviation textbooks. The pilots might survive if they could get pure oxygen quickly enough, but brain damage was occurring with every passing second. Maria looked at Emma with confusion and growing panic. "Honey, you need to go back to your seat. I'll handle this." But Emma could see that Maria was overwhelmed. The flight attendant was trying to perform CPR on Captain Torres, but that wouldn't help with carbon monoxide poisoning. Meanwhile, the aircraft continued its automated flight path, unaware that its human guardians were fighting for their lives. Emma grabbed the emergency oxygen mask from beside Captain Torres' seat and fitted it over his face, turning the flow to maximum. She did the same for First Officer Walsh, her small hands working with practiced efficiency. Her father had made her practice emergency procedures hundreds of times, never imagining that his 12-year-old daughter might one day need to save a commercial airliner. "What are you doing?" Maria demanded, but there was desperation in her voice now. She was beginning to realize that this situation was beyond her training. "Carbon monoxide poisoning," Emma explained quickly. "They need pure oxygen, not CPR. The autopilot is flying the plane, but if anything goes wrong..." She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what would happen if the autopilot disengaged or encountered a situation it couldn't handle. Through the cockpit windows, Emma could see the vast expanse of the Rocky Mountains stretching below them. Beautiful and deadly terrain that offered no safe landing options if they had to make an emergency descent. They were flying over some of the most unforgiving landscape in North America, completely dependent on the continued function of automated systems and the hope that the pilots would regain consciousness before those systems failed. But as Emma watched the two unconscious men, their faces pale beneath the oxygen masks, she realized with growing horror that hope might not be enough. The carbon monoxide had been in their systems for several minutes now. Even with pure oxygen, recovery could take time they didn't have. Behind them, passengers were beginning to notice the commotion. Voices rose in concern and confusion as word spread through the cabin that both pilots were down. Some passengers unbuckled their seatbelts and crowded toward the front of the aircraft, trying to see what was happening. Emma looked at the instrument panel, her father's training taking over despite her fear. Altitude, 30,000 feet and holding. Airspeed, 485 knots. Heading, 270 degrees west. Fuel, sufficient for another 2 hours of flight. All systems appeared normal except for the most critical system of all, the human beings who were supposed to be flying the aircraft. The autopilot could maintain their current flight path indefinitely, but it couldn't land the plane. It couldn't handle emergencies. It couldn't make the thousands of small decisions required to safely navigate through controlled airspace and deliver 183 souls to their destination. And as Emma stared at the complex array of switches, displays, and controls that surrounded her, she realized with crystalline clarity that she might be the only person on Flight 447 with any chance of getting them home alive. The moment of decision arrived with the sharp, insistent beeping of an altitude alert. Emma's blood turned to ice as she watched the autopilot disengage itself, a safety feature designed to prevent the system from making dangerous corrections when it detected conflicting inputs. Captain Torres, semi-conscious and delirious from carbon monoxide poisoning, had inadvertently bumped the control yoke with his elbow as his body convulsed slightly under the oxygen mask. Flight 447 immediately began a shallow but deadly descent. No, whispered, watching the altimeter spin downward. 29,800 feet, 29,600 feet, 29,400 feet. The massive Boeing 737, weighing over 150,000 pounds and carrying 183 souls, was now flying itself into the ground at a rate of 500 feet per minute. At this rate of descent, they had less than an hour before impact with the Rocky Mountains below. Maria was still trying to revive Captain Torres, shaking his shoulders and calling his name. But Emma could see it was hopeless. The pilot's eyes were open but unfocused, his pupils dilated and unresponsive. First Officer Walsh was completely unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular despite the oxygen mask. Behind them, the passenger cabin erupted into chaos as people felt the aircraft's nose drop and realized something was catastrophically wrong. Screams echoed through the fuselage as passengers who had been watching the cockpit drama began shouting about the unconscious pilots. Cell phones appeared as people tried desperately to call loved ones, not realizing that at 30,000 feet, most calls wouldn't connect. Emma stared at the pilot's seat, a massive leather chair designed for a full-grown adult, surrounded by an intimidating array of switches, displays, and controls that represented decades of aviation engineering. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. The aircraft doesn't care how old you are, or it only responds to correct inputs. Knowledge and training matter more than size or experience. She took a deep breath and made the decision that would either save 183 lives or add her name to the list of victims. "Maria, I need you to move Captain Torres," Emma said, her voice cutting through the flight attendant's panic with surprising authority. "What? Honey, you can't. I'm gonna fly this plane," Emma interrupted, already pushing past the flight attendant toward the captain's seat. "My father was Captain Miguel Rodriguez, 20 years with United Airlines. He trained me on Boeing 737 systems. I have over 500 hours on professional simulators." Maria stared at her in disbelief. "You're 12 years old, and I'm the only person on this aircraft who knows how to land it," Emma replied, climbing into the captain's seat. Her feet barely reached the rudder pedals, and she had to adjust the seat forward to its maximum position. But her hands found the controls with practiced familiarity. The first thing she did was pull back gently on the yoke, feeling the massive aircraft respond to her input. The descent rate slowed, then stopped, then reversed as Flight 447 began climbing back toward its assigned altitude. The sensation of controlling such an enormous machine sent a thrill of terror and exhilaration through her small frame. "Oh my God," Maria breathed, watching a 12-year-old girl successfully arrest the aircraft's descent. "How did you help me adjust this seat?" Emma said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I need to reach the pedals properly, and I need you to clear the passengers away from the cockpit. They're panicking." and I need to concentrate." Maria hesitated for only a moment before springing into action. She'd seen enough to know that this impossible child might be their only hope. She quickly adjusted Emma's seat and headset, then turned to face the crowd of terrified passengers pressing toward the cockpit. "Everyone back to your seats immediately," Maria commanded with newfound authority. "The situation is under control. Return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Emma's hands moved across the instrument panel with surprising confidence, checking engine parameters, fuel levels, and navigation system. Everything her father had taught her during those long hours in his home simulator was flooding back, muscle memory and theoretical knowledge combining into practical action. She reached for the radio microphone with trembling fingers. This was the moment of truth. Once she made this call, there would be no going back. Denver Center, this is United Flight 447. Declaring emergency, she said into the microphone, her young voice cutting through the radio static. The response came immediately. United 447, Denver Center, go ahead with your emergency. Emma took a deep breath. Denver Center, this is going to sound impossible, but both pilots on Flight 447 are unconscious due to suspected carbon monoxide poisoning. This is Emma Rodriguez, passenger, age 12. I am currently controlling the aircraft. Silence filled the radio frequency for several long seconds. In the Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center, controller Jake Morrison stared at his radar screen in disbelief. The transponder signal from Flight 447 showed the aircraft had descended nearly 600 feet before climbing back to altitude, exactly consistent with what the voice was telling him. United 447, say again your last transmission, Morrison requested, hoping he'd misunderstood. Denver Center, United 447. Both pilots are unconscious. I am Emma Rodriguez, 12 years old, daughter of Captain Miguel Rodriguez. I have extensive simulator training on Boeing 737 aircraft. I am currently flying the plane and need assistance with emergency procedures. Morrison's supervisor, hearing the transmission, immediately moved to the controller's position. This was either an elaborate hoax or the most extraordinary aviation emergency in history. But the radar data didn't lie. Someone was successfully controlling that aircraft. United 447, understand you have pilot incapacitation. Are you qualified to operate the aircraft? Morrison asked, following protocol while his mind raced through the implications. I have over 500 hours on professional flight simulators, Emma replied, her voice gaining confidence. My father trained me extensively on Boeing 737 systems and emergency procedures. I can maintain level flight and follow your instructions, but I'm going to need help with approach and landing procedures. In the passenger cabin, word was spreading that a child was flying the plane. Some passengers were praying, others were crying, and a few were trying to push past Maria to get into the cockpit. A businessman from first class was demanding to take control, claiming he'd flown small planes, but Maria blocked his way. She's doing better than you could, Maria told him firmly, watching Emma's steady hands on the controls. Look at the instruments. We're level, we're on course, and we're alive. Emma was indeed performing remarkably well. She'd engaged the autopilot's heading and altitude hold functions, giving her time to assess the situation more thoroughly. The aircraft was stable, the engines were running normally, and she had sufficient fuel for several hours of flight. But she knew the real challenge lay ahead, somehow getting this massive aircraft safely on the ground. Denver Center, United 447, she transmitted again. I need you to vector me to the nearest airport with long runways and emergency equipment. I also need you to contact my mother, Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, in Phoenix, and tell her what's happening. She needs to know I'm okay. Morrison was already coordinating with his supervisor to clear all airspace around Flight 447 and alert emergency services at Denver International Airport. But he was also thinking about the impossible task ahead. Landing a commercial airliner required split-second timing, precise control inputs, and years of experience. Could a 12-year-old girl, no matter how well trained, really accomplish what seasoned pilots sometimes struggled with? United 447, we're clearing you direct to Denver International Airport. Morrison transmitted. Runway 34 right is being prepared for your arrival. Emergency equipment is standing by. Emma, you're doing an outstanding job. We're going to get you through this. Emma felt a surge of gratitude for the controller's calm, professional voice. She wasn't alone in this. She had help. She had training, and she had her father's spirit guiding her every move. But as she looked out at the vast expanse of the Rocky Mountains below and realized she would soon have to attempt something that would challenge even the most experienced pilots, Emma whispered a quiet prayer to her father's memory. "Help me bring them home, Dad. Help me bring them all home." The hardest part was yet to come. The approach to Denver International Airport began 43 minutes after Emma first took control of Flight 447, and it would prove to be the longest 43 minutes of her young life. As the massive Boeing 737 descended through 18,000 feet, Emma faced a challenge that would test every lesson her father had ever taught her about aviation, and some he never had the chance to teach. United 447, Denver Approach Control, came the voice of controller Sarah Chen, who had taken over from Jake Morrison as the aircraft entered Denver's airspace. Turn left heading 90, descend and maintain 12,000 feet. We're vectoring you for a straight in approach to runway 34 right. Emma's small hands gripped the yoke as she disengaged the autopilot and began the turn. The aircraft responded smoothly to her inputs, but she could feel the enormous weight and momentum of the machine she was controlling. At 485 knots and weighing over 140,000 pounds, Flight 447 was like a massive freight train that required careful planning to slow down and stop. "Descending to 12,000 feet heading 90, Emma replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. She pulled back the throttle slightly and pushed the yoke forward, feeling the aircraft's nose drop into a controlled descent. The altimeter began unwinding. 17,500 feet, 17,000 feet, 16,500 feet. Behind her, Captain Torres was showing signs of improvement. The pure oxygen had begun to clear some of the carbon monoxide from his bloodstream, and his eyes were tracking movement, though he remained disoriented and unable to speak coherently. First Officer Walsh was still unconscious but breathing more regularly. "Emma," came a new voice over the radio, calm, authoritative, and reassuring. "This is Captain Rebecca Martinez, United Airlines chief pilot. I'm here in the Denver Tower to help talk you through the approach and landing. You're doing an incredible job so far." Emma felt a wave of relief. Having an experienced airline captain guiding her made the impossible seem merely improbable. "Thank you, Captain Martinez. I'm scared, but I'm ready to follow your instructions." "I know you are, sweetheart. Your father would be so proud of you right now. Now, let's get you and everyone else home safely. First, I need you to configure the aircraft for approach. Can you see the flap lever on the center console?" Emma scanned the center console and found the flap lever, a large handle with the tent positions marked from 0 to 40 degrees. "I see it, Captain." "Good. Move it to the first position. That's flaps 5. You'll feel the aircraft want to pitch up slightly when you do this, so be ready to push the nose down a little to maintain your descent." Emma moved the flap lever to the first position and immediately felt the aircraft's nose rise as the wing flaps increased lift. She pushed forward gently on the yoke, maintaining her descent rate as the airspeed began to decrease. The aircraft felt different now, more stable but also more sensitive to control inputs. "Perfect, Emma. Now I need you to slow down to 250 knots. Pull the throttles back gradually until your airspeed indicator shows 250. This was where Emma's simulator training proved invaluable. She'd practiced this exact procedure hundreds of times, though never with 183 real lives depending on her performance. She eased the throttles back, watching the airspeed indicator slowly decrease. 400 knots, 300 knots, 300 knots, 300 knots, 200 knots, 200 knots. United 447, turn right heading 120. Continue descent to 8,000 feet, came the approach controller's voice. Emma banked the aircraft to the right, feeling the massive machine respond to her control inputs. Through the cockpit windows, she could see Denver International Airport in the distance, a sprawling complex of runways and terminals that looked impossibly small from her current altitude. Emma, you're doing beautifully, Captain Martinez said. Now, I need to prepare you for something that might be challenging. The winds at Denver are gusting to 25 knots from the northwest, which means you'll have a crosswind during landing. Do you remember your father teaching you about crosswind landings? Emma's heart sank. Crosswind landings were among the most difficult maneuvers in aviation, requiring precise coordination of rudder and aileron inputs to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway while compensating for the wind trying to push it sideways. She'd practiced them in the simulator, but never in real weather conditions. Yes, ma'am. Crab into the wind during approach, then kick out the crab with rudder just before touchdown while using aileron to keep the wings level. Exactly right. You know the theory perfectly. Now we're going to put it into practice. As Flight 447 descended through 10,000 feet, Emma could feel the aircraft being buffeted by mountain wave turbulence, invisible rivers of air flowing over the Rocky Mountains that created sudden updrafts and downdrafts. The aircraft would suddenly climb 200 feet, then drop 300 feet, then climb again like a roller coaster made of air. Make small corrections and let the aircraft ride through the bumps. You're doing great. Emma gritted her teeth and focused on maintaining her heading and approximate altitude, making small control inputs to counteract the worst of the turbulence. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Smooth inputs, Emma. The aircraft wants to fly straight and level. Help it do what it wants to do. United 447, turn left heading 340, descend to 6,000 feet. You're 8 miles from the runway. 8 miles. Emma could see the runway clearly now. A long strip of concrete that looked like a narrow ribbon from her altitude. Emergency vehicles were lined up along both sides of the runway, their red and blue lights flashing in the afternoon sun. News helicopters circled at a safe distance, broadcasting the unprecedented emergency to the world. Emma, it's time to configure for landing, Captain Martinez said. Move your flaps to position 15 and extend your landing gear. The gear lever is on your right side panel. It looks like a small wheel. Emma found the landing gear lever and moved it to the down position. She felt and heard the massive landing gear assemblies extending beneath the aircraft, 3 sets of wheels that would hopefully cushion their touchdown in a few minutes. The flaps extension to 15 degrees made the aircraft feel even more stable, but also more sensitive to power changes. Landing gear down and locked, flaps 15. Emma reported, checking the green lights that confirmed the gear was properly extended. Beautiful. Now slow to 180 knots and descend to 4,000 feet. You're on a perfect approach path. But as Emma reduced power and continued her descent, she encountered the mountain wave turbulence at its worst. The aircraft suddenly dropped 400 feet in a massive downdraft, then rocketed upward 500 feet in an equally violent updraft. Emma's stomach lurched as she fought to maintain control, her small hands gripping the yoke with white knuckles. "Stay with it, Emma!" Captain Martinez called. "You're in mountain wave turbulence. It's going to be rough, but you can handle it. Small corrections, don't over-control." The runway was growing larger in the windscreen now, but Emma could see that the crosswind was pushing them to the left of the center line. She pressed the right rudder pedal, their short legs barely reaching it, even with the seat fully forward, and felt the aircraft's nose swing right to compensate for the wind. United 447, you're cleared to land runway 34 right. Wind 320 at 2220 at 28, not gusts. Emma's father had told her that crosswinds above 25 knots were challenging, even for experienced pilots. But there was no choice now. They were committed to this approach, and she had to make it work. "Emma, final configuration," Captain Martinez said. "Flaps to 30 degrees, slow to 150 knots. You're 2 miles from touchdown." Emma moved the flaps to their final position and reduced power further. The aircraft felt heavy and stable now, but the crosswind was becoming more apparent as they got closer to the ground. She could see the runway clearly. 12,000 feet of concrete that represented safety for 183 souls. 1 mile from touchdown, Emma. You're doing perfectly. Remember, keep the aircraft crabbed into the wind until just before touchdown, then use rudder to align with the runway centerline. Emma's heart pounded as the runway rushed up to meet. This was it. The moment that would determine whether her father's training and her own courage would be enough to save everyone on board Flight 447. The final approach to runway 34, right at Denver International Airport, unfolded like a slow-motion ballet of physics, courage, and pure determination. Emma Rodriguez, her small frame dwarfed by the captain's seat, gripped the yoke with hands that had stopped trembling despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. Through the windscreen, the runway grew from a distant strip of concrete into a massive expanse of salvation. 12,000 feet of precisely engineered asphalt that represented the difference between life and death for 183 souls. 500 feet above ground level, Captain Martinez's voice came through the headset, calm and steady, despite the unprecedented nature of what she was witnessing. Emma, you're perfectly aligned with the runway centerline. Maintain your current descent rate and airspeed. But Emma could feel the crosswind intensifying as they descended into the surface wind layer. The Boeing 737, weighing nearly 140,000 pounds and traveling at 145 knots, was being pushed sideways by gusts that reached 30 knots. She pressed harder on the right rudder pedal, her short legs straining to reach it properly, while simultaneously applying left aileron to keep the wings level. The aircraft was now flying in a pronounced crab angle, nose pointed significantly right of the runway, heading to compensate for the wind drift. 400 feet came the altitude call-out from the aircraft's automated systems. 300 feet. Emma's father's voice echoed in her memory from countless simulator sessions. The last 200 feet are where landings are won or lost, Emma. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and remember, the aircraft wants to land safely. Help it do what it wants to do. Behind her, Captain Torres had regained enough consciousness to realize what was happening. His vision was still blurry from the carbon monoxide poisoning, and his coordination remained severely impaired, but he could see a child in his seat, flying his aircraft with remarkable skill. Good job, he managed to whisper through his oxygen mask, his voice barely audible. First Officer Walsh was stirring as well, the pure oxygen gradually clearing the deadly gas from his bloodstream. But both pilots remained too incapacitated to take control, leaving Emma as the sole barrier between 183 people and disaster. 200 feet, the automated voice announced. 100 feet. This was the critical moment, the point where Emma had to transition from the crabbed approach to a wings-level touchdown aligned with the runway. She'd practiced this maneuver hundreds of times in the simulator, but never with real wind, real turbulence, and real consequences. Now, Emma, Captain Martinez called. Kick out the crab. Right rudder to align with the runway, left aileron to keep the wings level. Emma pressed the right rudder pedal with all her strength while simultaneously moving the yoke left. The aircraft's nose swung toward the runway centerline just as a violent gust of wind tried to push them off course. For a terrifying moment, the massive Boeing seemed to hang in the air, caught between Emma's control inputs and the chaotic mountain winds. 50 feet, the altitude call-out continued. 40 feet, 30 feet. The runway was rushing up at them now, the white centerline stripes blurring past at 140 miles per hour. Emma could see the emergency vehicles lined up along both sides of the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue equipment all standing by for what everyone hoped would be an unnecessary response. 20 feet, 10 feet. Emma pulled back gently on the yoke, beginning the flare that would cushion their touchdown. But the crosswind chose that exact moment to shift, hitting them with a sudden gust from a slightly different direction. The aircraft lurched to the left main landing gear heading for the grass beside the runway. Right rudder! Right rudder! Captain Martinez shouted, her professional composure finally cracking as she watched the aircraft drift toward disaster. Emma stomped on the right rudder pedal with both feet, her small frame straining against the massive control forces. The aircraft's nose swung back toward the centerline just as the main landing gear touched down with a bone-jarring thud that sent shockwaves through the entire fuselage. They were down, but not safely down. The aircraft was still traveling at over 120 miles per hour, and the crosswind was trying to weather vane them off the runway. Emma kept her feet pressed hard on the rudder pedals, fighting to keep the aircraft tracking straight down the centerline as she reached for the thrust reversers. Thrust reversers, Captain Martinez called. Pull the thrust reverser levers up and back. Emma found the thrust reverser levers and pulled them into the deployed position. The engine's roar changed pitch as the massive turbofans redirected their thrust forward, helping to slow the aircraft. But they were still going too fast, and the runway end was approaching with alarming speed. "Brakes, Emma! Stand on the brakes!" Emma pressed down on the brake pedals at the top of the rudder pedals, feeling the aircraft's anti-skid system pulse under her feet as the massive disc brakes fought to bring 140,000 pounds of aircraft to a stop. The deceleration was violent. Passengers were thrown forward against their seatbelts as the Boeing 737 fought against its own momentum. The runway end markers flashed past. 3,000 feet remaining, 2,000 feet, 1,000 feet. Emma could see the overrun area beyond the runway, a specially prepared surface designed to stop aircraft that couldn't stop on the runway itself. They were going to make it, but just barely. At 500 feet from the runway end, Flight 447 finally rolled to a complete stop. The sudden silence was deafening after the roar of engines and the screech of brakes. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the passenger cabin erupted in cheers, applause, and tears of relief as 183 people realized they were alive and safe on the ground. Emma sat in the captain's seat, her hands still gripping the yoke, her body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. She'd landed a commercial airliner with no help except radio guidance and her father's training. "Emma," Captain Martinez's voice came through the headset, thick with emotion. "That was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever witnessed. You saved every single person on that aircraft." Emergency vehicles surrounded Flight 447 within seconds, their crews ready to respond to any fire or medical emergency. But the aircraft sat intact and undamaged on the runway, its engines winding down to silence as Emma finally released the parking brake and shut down the systems. Captain Torres, now more alert thanks to the continued oxygen therapy, reached over and placed a trembling hand on Emma's shoulder. "Your father," he said, his voice hoarse but clear, "would be so proud of you. You're a natural pilot, kid." A real pilot. First Officer Walsh, though still weak, managed to sit up and look at the instrument panel. Every system showed normal, no damage, no problems, just a perfectly executed emergency landing by a 12-year-old girl who had saved their lives. As the aircraft door opened and emergency medical personnel rushed aboard to treat the pilots, Emma finally allowed herself to cry. The weight of what she'd accomplished, the terror she'd suppressed, and the overwhelming relief of survival all crashed over her at once. Flight attendant Maria, who had watched the entire landing from the jump seat behind the cockpit, unbuckled her harness and knelt beside Emma's seat. "You did it, sweetheart. You brought us all home." Outside, news crews were already setting up their cameras, and aviation experts around the world were trying to comprehend what had just happened. A 12-year-old girl had successfully landed a commercial airliner under emergency conditions, something that would be talked about in aviation circles for decades to come. But for Emma, sitting in her father's profession seat with tears streaming down her face, there was only one thought that mattered. She had honored his memory and his training. She had proven that knowledge, courage, and determination could overcome any obstacle, even when that obstacle seemed impossible. As she was helped from the cockpit by paramedics who wanted to check her for shock and exhaustion, Emma looked back at the instrument panel one last time. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. "Thank you for teaching me to fly." Flight 447 had landed safely, and Emma Rodriguez had earned her place in aviation history as the youngest person ever to successfully pilot a commercial airliner to safety. But more importantly, she had brought 183 people home to their families, fulfilling the sacred trust that every pilot carries to deliver their passengers safely to their destination, no matter what challenges they face along the way.